welcome to today's webinar, Mapping Viticulture Suitability in Arkansas, AVAs and Vineyards, brought to you by the Arkansas GIS Users Forum and the Arkansas State University College of Agriculture. My name is Chad and I'll be your host today. I'm joined by our panelist, Dino Trawick, the City of Fort Smith GIS Manager and the Arkansas GIS Users Forum Chair, Sharon Hawkins, the RDOT GIS and Mapping Administrator and Chair of the Arkansas GIS Board. Also Brian Culpepper, Senior Research Analyst at CAST with the University of Arkansas, and Daryl Allen, the City of Hope GIS and Technology Coordinator. We would ask anyone who has a question today to feel free to use the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom control screen. You can click that Q&A option and the Q&A window will pop up. Feel free to type your questions in the Q&A window at any time, and all of your questions will be answered at the end of today's presentation. The other options also available are the chat function. Feel free to chat with our panelists and other members, as well as if you'd like to join the conversation at the end to pose your question, feel free to use the raise your hand option. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. John Nowlin, GISP, to present Mapping Viticulture Suitability in Arkansas, AVAs and Vineyards. John, we'll turn things over to you.
All right, I'm really glad you guys joined me today and get to share some of the stuff I'm doing up here at Arkansas State University. I teach in the College of Agriculture here. I am a geographer. I did all of my degrees over in North Carolina, and both my thesis and my dissertation work was in the same area that I'm going to talk to you about today. So when I say, if I'll go back to the title, viticultural suitability, there's another word that people use with viticulture that relates to suitability, and that is terroir. So here Merriam-Webster has defined terroir as the combination of factors, including soil, climate, and sunlight, that gives wine grapes their distinctive character. But I would define it as the combination of all environmental and human factors that impart a regional character to wine. So this is a thing we often do in academia to try to describe where this fits. It's a Venn diagram showing this kind of intersection between wine, humans, and the environment. And so I'm primarily going to be focusing on that environment piece, but both terroir and the wine region fit in that middle because humans are, in fact, grow the grapes and make all the choices associated with how they're harvested, and they make the wine, and they consume the wine, and they make all the choices about how the wine is made and what wine they consume. So it's really about mating this idea of terroir to your local conditions, or really explaining how wines in given areas come from areas of different conditions with different human practices and different environments. And when I say environment, I mean the physical environment. I could call this physical terroir, if you will. So we both fit in that middle area. My main aim in the project I'm working on that I'm producing this presentation from is to map the viticultural suitability here in Arkansas. And if I ever say North Carolina, just know it's because I came from there, and it's a huge mistake on my part. You can rib me about it later. When I say viticultural suitability, I'm really, as I said before, talking about physical terroir in these four areas. So the physiography, or in our state, in terms of our state, kind of the region of the state that we're in and its physical characteristics, land cover is one of those, or what's typical in that region for land cover. The soil characteristics I'm currently looking at are depth, drainage class, AWC, or available water capacity, and different measures of fertility. And then we'll talk a lot about topography, both in more in relative terms than absolute terms here in Arkansas. In other words, how the land is situated elevation-wise around the vineyard. And then climate. So there's lots of different indices which are used to describe how certain wine regions function. In other words, how long their growing seasons are, how hot they get, what precipitation regime they're in. And so for the purposes of our work here, we'll just talk about how much precipitation we get. I'll go through one that's not so common related to Pierce's disease, and then we'll talk about just basic climate and temperature suitability. And then we'll end with the two that are used commonly internationally, which are growing degree day and growing season temperature based. And I'll be more specific as we go through those. So Arkansas does have a background as far as wine is concerned. It does have a history. Europeans brought wine here and winemaking here. Germans, Swiss, and Italians. And it was made in the early 1800s, but by 1870, there was a commercial wine industry here. Prohibition entirely destroyed that industry. So this period from 1920, when it was enacted in the state, to 1933, when it was ended nationwide, really just almost destroyed everything. But currently, we have about 20 commercial wineries. That's always in flux, of course, and with COVID, they're in being an industry that requires people to come through the vineyard, I'm sure some wineries have really struggled. So there's a federal agency which regulates wineries in the U.S. It used to be just ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, but after 2003, there's a specific segment of that called the TTB, or Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. So when you're wanting to bottle wine, when you're wanting to make a label, when you're wanting to sell wine to the public, they're the people who control that at the federal level. And so in the Federal Register and then eventually the Code of Federal Regulations is the place where the statutes describe what you can do here. And so here in the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, Title 27, Chapter 4, we see the rules associated with the kind of areas that you can put on the label. Areas associated with where the wine is grown. A state, a county, a group of 3 states, a group of 3 counties, that idea. And then what we call a recognized delimited grape growing area. And so we call those American Viticultural Areas here in the U.S. And Chapter 9 of Title 27 is all about American Viticultural Areas, both how you go about acquiring an area, but in this chapter, all of the areas that exist and are approved. So what do you have to do to go through the process of having an area designated as an AVA? That's the section I have up here now. The name has to be used by people, right? And you have to prove that. It has to have an identity. And you have to present evidence that that identity is used publicly. You have to have evidence of the boundary of this area that that identity is related to. And then you talk about its distinguishing features, right? So climate, geology, soils, physical features, elevation, etc. And so that's kind of why I'm talking through these things, because one, it gives our AVAs a set of characteristics they can talk about when they're presenting their products, but it also might encourage the creation of an AVA. You have to use USGS maps. The topo quads are what are commonly used, like you might use if you were hiking, and they don't share the maps that people send in with their application. All they do is have a description of the lines on those maps or different features on those maps that were used to make the boundary of the AVA. So when you read the law, you don't see the lines, you have to infer them using the maps that they reference. Here in Arkansas, we have 3 AVAs that have been approved: Altus, Ozark Mountain, and Arkansas Mountain, and I have them in date order, all in the mid-80s. Now, I have an asterisk beside Ozark Mountain because it's shared with 2 other states, Oklahoma and Missouri. The best map I could find of Arkansas's AVAs before I did this work was this map here, and I gave you the link in case you're interested. But I could tell from looking at the map that it's not as accurate as it might be. So I got the opportunity to have this honor student, Lania Wall, and for her honors project, she went to the Code of Federal Regulations and delimited all of these 3 AVAs. And so this describes a little bit about her process, right? Now I did all this in over in North Carolina, so I described her what to do, and then she did all the steps on her own. She had to read those AVA descriptions in the Code of Federal Regulations, and then make a list of the reference data sources that were used. In other words, if the description said it followed a river or a road or a county boundary, she would go and get the authoritative set of rivers, roads, or county boundaries from the authoritative agency. And essentially, most of these are vector data, with one exception. If you follow a topo line, those are not vector anywhere. That's a digital raster graphic background, and you basically have to follow the topo line, which is a nightmare. And so in North Carolina, they had that issue, but I don't think she ran into that here. What we did then is essentially create vector polygons using and tracing the boundaries given on our features, and then having as a base map the topo map to verify that the topo map was in agreement with the vector features we had. Where it was not, we followed the topo map. And so what we now have is a precise set of boundaries for the American Viticultural Areas here in Arkansas, and then also the one that we share, Ozark Mountain AVA, with Oklahoma and Missouri. But I know you're probably interested in this area since we are an Arkansas group. So these circles you see on the map are the vineyards that I found just using publicly available data. And so you can see there's this kind of dense, dark area, and I've got Altus AVA label kind of pointed to that area. That is really the densest and oldest area of vineyards in the state. It's the only one I've gone to a tasting room at. And I visited at least, I guess there were 4 wineries I visited while I was there. I may have missed one, but I haven't been to any of these others. But you can see that only some of them can use any one of our given AVAs on their label. And so a certain percentage of the grapes producing that wine have to come from within the AVA to use the name of the AVA on the label. I think it's 85. So you get an idea that maybe those in the northern part of our state have an AVA they can put on their label, but there is none in the southern part of our state. The Ouachita, at least in the central part of our state, might be a good place to consider an AVA in the future. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I did in North Carolina. Y'all had a better map online than they did. This was their best map before I did my work there, and kind of got started on being precise. And so this is, after I'd finished there, what I produced as I finished. And you can see that there's some kind of question about whether or not the way we do these appellations. So these zones, these AVAs, are also called appellations. You're giving this region some kind of power because they're controlling the use of a term on a label. So in Europe, they have a lot more control than here over what happens in that region. We're basically only controlling the name of the region. They're controlling what happens in that region. But I have a little bit of a problem with how we do this in the U.S. because you can see in this zone, and I didn't use Arkansas as an example, but North Carolina has a really good example. Here you can see in the southwestern portion of North Carolina, there's this really curvy line that follows a topo line. And here, there were several different points that would say, now go 10 miles northwest to this point. So it's not likely that the physical environment follows both of these patterns, right? So it's really much more about economics here in the US. And these three AVAs, I could say, are a little bit more tied to physiography. Definitely this one in the west, but Haw River AVA in the middle has a lot of straight lines that don't lend themselves to physical. That is not the way that physical environment is arranged. So not only are we not like Europe in that we don't control the use of terms exactly the same way, but we, as I said before, we don't control the activity. So we do control which AVAs go, or other kind of regional terms go on the label. We do control what that is called a DO, or a designation of origin. And they have designations of origin in Europe, or geographic indications is another kind of synonym for that worldwide. And then they have to record their boundaries, and there's a process. We do record our boundaries, and there's a process. But currently, we just don't have what you would call the cultural restrictions that they have. So that's the method of training the grapes, or how the structure of the way that the vineyard is laid out and what structure the vine is growing on. We don't control that. They do. So like over in France, in Champagne, there's a specific structure that the vine has to be in. And they also limit what varieties you can grow, how much you can grow per area. And we don't have any of those restrictions here. So it's kind of like what happens around the world. The AOCs, DOCs, DOs, DOCGs, you see those values on your European wine labels. Ours is the AVA, but it's a little different. It's more just about an argument made about the identity of an area and a limit on who can use that term. You can be critical of that, which I already kind of had revealed. It's kind of arbitrary sometimes. Sometimes you have the straight lines, sometimes you have the curvy lines. And so we have less restrictions, but that could mean it also has a little bit less meaning, right? And it's kind of ambiguous sometimes. So I really think we should just think of these as communicating to the consumer about where this wine came from, and in another way, protecting the identity associated with that to the people that are in those areas that have been approved. Okay, let's just kind of look at our vineyards again. Here you can see that I've got it looks like a little pink dot in the middle of each of these circles, but that's actually the boundary around the vineyard that I'm highlighting. So if I was to zoom in, which I'll do to Altus here, these are all the vineyards that I could find with aerial imagery in the Altus AVA. And they're all fairly close to each other. And so I'll talk specifically about a winery that's right here. And I'll have all of these vineyards associated with that winery, but I don't know who owns the vineyard. They're just the closest ones to that winery. And that winery is Chateau Ozark. I think that's a witty name, Ozark. And it's I did visit this winery, and you can see the problem with aerial imagery and trying to delimit something with aerial imagery, because right here, and they, when people are collecting imagery, they do their best to fly in clear conditions, but we didn't have clear conditions, so ended up having to use multiple different sources. And you can see it looks like this is a newer image than what I used. And you can see there's vineyard here now that I don't even have. So this is a work in progress. But this is the nape, the most recent nape image I could get. I think it was 2019, and so that's fairly recent. And so over the last 2 years, it looks like they've prepared this, and it doesn't even look like this zone right here was prepared when this image was taken. But for me, the definition of a vineyard block is the area bounded by where the canopy of the grapes are. And so, like I said, I use multiple sources here because of the clouds. And I did get a fairly recent source that I was able to follow. And they're not all perfect blocks. This southeast corner block is fairly good. But you see that, they're following roads sometimes. And they're a little bit messy sometimes. So it's hard to, on a state scale, get a real sense of vineyard area. Also, this vineyard may report a different area than I'm reporting. It really legitimately does take all of these roads and alleys between blocks to do the work of the vineyard. So I don't mean to state any kind of acreage of all of that operation, just the acreage and vines themselves. This was the favorite wine I tasted at Chateau Ozark. As you know, our state grape is Cynthiana. Now, I'm a winemaker myself. That's what got me interested in this. And I've made a wine from this grape, but I know that grape is Norton, which is what they call it in Missouri. So when I tasted this grape, and as I was talking to the person in the tasting room, I said, well, this is Norton. I've made Norton before. And she reminded me that this is not Norton, this is Cynthiana. But we do know that those are genetically the same grape. And Cynthiana received its formal name, and you can use that name, but it is the same grape as Norton, which is also grown in Virginia. So Virginia, Missouri, and Arkansas are really the primary places this grape is grown. And what's great about it is its parentage relies on a lot of native genetics. So you don't really have to use as much fungicide or pesticide when you grow Cynthiana. So I really like that about it. So Norton, Cynthiana, whatever you call it, this is something that we grow here. Here I've got a view of our physiographic regions. We tend to call this region I've labeled Mississippi Alluvial Plain the Delta. And we sometimes divide up the Ozarks into the Boston Mountains and Ozark Highlands, but I combined them for the purposes here because this is how the state thinks about its physiographic regions. And I overlaid the AVAs so you can get a sense that the Arkansas Valley AVA is actually a little bit in that would be the Boston Mountains. And then all the Altus AVA is in the Arkansas Valley. And most of the Ozark Highlands or the Ozark Mountain AVA is in the Ozarks. But this, you can see, you could probably come up with a Ouachita AVA because you do have some vineyards in that region. Now, one really important aspect of the physical environment that goes along with your physiographic region, these are actually controlled by the EPA and described as ecoregions, but they're talking about like all of those components of the physical environment that come together to create a different kind of biome, if you will. And so land cover tends to be a really important component of that. And here I've zoomed out to the whole Southeast, and you get a real sense of just how cleared away our forests are in eastern Arkansas. That tan color is cultivated crops, and a very close color is grasslands. And so if we have grasslands or cultivated crops, that's a cleared area, right? But if it's forested, there's a lot of effort that has to go into clearing that forest. And there's some pathogens that live in the roots, soil nematodes that would be happy to chomp on your grapevine. So you tend to have to put a cleared forest, a prior cleared forested area that you're clearing for a vineyard. You have to put it in maybe some crops that will kill those nematodes over a few growing seasons. Two of those crops would be canola and wheat. Canola and wheat are known to have a negative effect on the pathogens in the soil that negatively affect grapevines for the most part. So if you're going to choose a site for a vineyard and it's in one of the forested areas, then you probably are going to have to put more effort and more cost into putting it there. But that doesn't mean you can't. Under that grapevine, of course, there's a large root structure. And in this region, you know, if you think about where wine is grown around the world, it's typically much drier than this region. While our temperatures are pretty close to many of the renowned world wine regions, like Bordeaux, or even South Languedoc, or in Galicia in Spain. Those are kind of the zone of temperatures that we experience here in Arkansas. They tend to have less precipitation. Now, there is precipitation in Bordeaux, but if you think about southern Spain, it's pretty dry, and there's a periodicity to when they receive their precipitation that's a little different than ours. They basically never get rain in the summer, and we do get less rain in the summer here, but you get the idea. This vine has a huge root structure, and in our case, the more fertile the soil and the more water that vine gets, the more of a leaf monster you create rather than a grape making machine. So a lot of these decisions we make about soil parameters really have to do with growing grapes instead of leaves. And John Boyer and Tony Wolf's a state viticulturist over in Virginia, and I used a lot of his guidance on soil characteristics. But you do need some soil, but not so much actually, because grapes have a great root system over time, and they can fend for themselves after they're established. You may need to do some watering initially, but typically they can deal with quite shallow and poor soils. Available water capacity is really just how much water is available in the soil for grapes. So if it's less than 1/10 of a centimeter per centimeter of soil, that is very little water capacity, like sand. And then if it's greater than, say, 15 or 16 or tenths, if you will, then it's hundredths. If it's basically really small particles that hold into water well, then you're going to make more leaf monsters, right? So you want to be away from those higher available water capacity soils and towards those lower available water capacity soils, just so that you don't have to trim those leaves so much, and so that the grapes get an opportunity, the vines get an opportunity to focus on making babies instead of making leaves. Now, I didn't actually get to, these are not parameterized, if you will. I didn't get to grade, land cover, or some of the soil parameters I'm going to show you. So I just took screenshots of what I'm working on. I didn't actually apply them to the model. But here you can see as a reference the Altus AVA, and you see some patterns which you can associate with agriculture in the region. Our delta soils are fairly poorly drained, while all the other soils in the state, except for those right on the alluvial plain of the Arkansas River, are pretty well drained. And so you just want to be in an area that's at least better than somewhat poorly drained. So moderately well drained all the way up to excessively drained would be just fine for us. Here's one big problem I have with soil, the way that we deal with soil at the federal level. What we do is we take these soil surveys, which happen at the county scale, and then we basically mosaic them over time. And you can see over here in Arkansas some rather county-shaped like zones that show up when you start asking questions like, give me all the soils greater than or fail all the soils less than 39 centimeters. It's not likely that they follow the county boundaries quite this well. So I think that's just an inherent problem working with this agglomerated or like a data set that has come from many places over many times. But it can give you a kind of general idea of the zones of the state that are going to have shallow soils in the case of depth. So you get to see maybe in the Ouachita and up in their mountains, we do have some areas of fairly shallow soil that may not be appropriate. Also, this is big chunks that I pieced together of available water supply. It's a similar idea, but they just fix the volume of soil. And so you can see in the Delta, we actually have quite a lot of water supply, right? Lots of water. But in our highlands, we have soils that don't hold so much water. And so that's good as far as grapes are concerned, because we get so much precipitation. The more water we have, the more leaves we grow. And you know grapes grow in fairly dry areas. So we want to be probably in our, at least one of our mountainous areas. There are some zones along Corley's Ridge that seem to suggest suitability in that area as well. As far as climate is concerned, I just put the acronyms here, but I'll read through them. SFI is Spring Frost Index. FFP is Frost-Free Period. That's a conservative estimate for growing season length. That's the boundaries of 32 degrees Fahrenheit as opposed to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is, we have such a long growing season here, I used the more conservative estimate. Growing degree days is how much heat you accumulate above a certain base temperature. And in the case of wine, along with most crops, it's 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. And so this is growing degree days at a base 50 Fahrenheit. Growing season temperature, this is the mean growing season temperature. And then ECR stands for extreme cold risk. And then the kind of weird ones. Well, slope's not weird. That's how steep the land surface is. But Pierce's disease risk is pretty odd, and you don't find that modeled so often, but it's our primary reason why Vitis vinifera dies here in the Southeast. So we need to know these temperature thresholds, which Turner Sutton has validated with experimental work that predict where you're going to have that disease. And then TPI, Topographic Position Index, is an index which gives you an indication of where you are in relative elevation terms associated to the landforms around you. Are you on a ridge? Are you somewhere? Are you in a valley? Are you somewhere mid-slope? And so we'll talk through why that's important as I show you some of the maps where I've graded these surfaces. For climate data, I looked at these 4 metrics: precipitation, and each index uses different ones, but precipitation, minimum temperature, maximum temperature, and mean temperature every single day for the whole US, actually, and then I clicked out our area from 1981 to 2020, which is 58,000 maps. So I iterated through those using Model Builder and its iteration tools. And that took a while sometimes, depending upon what questions I was asking. And PRISM was my primary data set, the PRISM Climate Group out of Southern Oregon, or Oregon State, sorry. And so you can see that this is the pattern of precipitation across the Southeast. And I just wanted to show you everything and kind of give you an idea of how Arkansas fits into that. We do get more precipitation in the Ouachita than in the Boston Mountains, but they're both fairly high compared to the rest of the state. And so this zone of North Carolina gets the least. And so it's kind of comparable to the North Carolina wine growing regions as far as annual precipitation is concerned. The good thing about it is we get less of that in the summer than they do. So in a way, we are better off than North Carolina on the precipitation regime. So spring frost index gives you an indication of how likely a killing frost will occur. It's the difference between the average and the minimum frost temperature, or the average and the minimum temperature in April for spring. And so actually the delta scores very high on this because there's a pretty small difference in the delta between your minimum temperature and your mean temperature for April. But you can see that there are some zones that may have a higher risk for frost. This really matters when you have early bud breaking varieties like Chardonnay. Chardonnay breaks bud when it warms for a few weeks, and when a killing frost comes along, you've knocked out most of your productive growth. It'll break bud from a secondary or even a tertiary bud, and the vegetation side will be fine, but that first bud, that primary bud, is the fruitful bud. So here we're planning for when frost could kill your investment. Then this is kind of the growing season length idea again, mean frost-free period, and you get to see the number of days here. Red is longer and blue is shorter. And so we have plenty growing season. That's basically the story this tells. And up here in Missouri, maybe in the Ozark Mountain AVA, they couldn't grow all varieties and would be limited by this metric. The mean growing degree days has a similar pattern, but because it's classified here, you kind of get the bigger, pattern instead of that more precise one that you saw over here for frost-free period. But in the South, in the Southeast, we have hotter and longer growing seasons. In the North, the Northwest specifically, we have areas with shorter and cooler growing seasons. And so our mean growing season temperature is exactly the same as the primary wine growing region of Arkansas in our primary grape growing region. They also grow grapes over here, mostly muscadines in the east. And so for us, I presume a lot of these muscadine vineyards in this the Ouachita are growing or a lot of the vineyards in the Ouachita are likely growing muscadines. This is really a very important person as it comes to analyzing which grapes fit into what climate regime. His name is Greg Jones. He was on my committee, and a lot of my research is patterned after him. But you can see a set of varieties here and get a sense of the growing, or this is the average growing season temperature, kind of like classes that exist. And so we kind of fit in this warm and hot zone. I'll go back to that. There's again our growing season temperature. This is a hot zone in orange, and this kind of lighter color of orange is warm. So if we think about which varieties may work for us, we should probably be looking on the right side of this graph. When we talk about extreme cold risk, -8 degrees Fahrenheit, at -8 degrees Fahrenheit, you start killing about 50% of your vine wood. So they probably experienced some considerable injury in the northwest of Arkansas this last winter. But these are the averages over time. You look at the number of days per decade, and more than 3 days per decade would be failing, if you will, or really cold. And on this case, that would be the blue color. And then towards the blue color, so yellow towards blue, they do have some risk of killing your wood. And we got it even though we're in a fairly low risk zone. Altus probably had some killing extreme cold this winter. Here's the primary vectors of Pierce's disease on the right side of the screen. They're leaf hoppers, sharpshooters, the versute, the blue-green, and glassy wing sharpshooter. And what they do is as they scrape the leaf, they deposit this disease. It's a bacterium that clogs the xylem of the plant, and it shows up as a drought. So just like we had in the past where you had kind of old, not really clear maps, I tried to repair that. This one is out of Texas in the early 2000s, and these are kind of in the mid 2000s. Texas has done quite a lot of work on Pierce's disease because it was a big problem there. But it's even in California now. And it's primarily limited by winter freezing temperatures, so California could have a real problem in the future. So I tried to improve on this map with a modeling technique. This is Turner Sutton's maps. They were even better than the last ones. He gave kind of these 3 zones of risk associated with those 2 thresholds. If you're at least 3, 4, or 5 days below this threshold per winter, or 1, 2, or 3 days below this threshold per winter, you're going to have a varying degree of Pierce's disease risk. But I was able to do that much more precisely using Prism. And so you can see a higher resolution view of that same idea. And I just combined later on in the modeling both of those thresholds. So I'm going to go back and forth now between -12.2C, -9.4C, just so you can fix in your mind how the patterns are there are some differences to them, but you get a general idea. North and west, not a problem. South and east, especially across the whole south of Arkansas, likely Pierce's disease risk zone. This fella, Andy Walker, is a geneticist at UC Davis, and he's developed a series of Pierce's disease resistant varietals. And you can see some varietal trial. They've made wine from them. He found in Vitis arizonica, there was a single gene which predicted for Pierce's disease resistance. So instead of having to grow the vines, get grapes, wait till they die to see if they're resistant, you could basically do a genetic analysis. And so they've bred a series of cultivars that are like 97, 93, and 87% Vitis vinifera, which is the European wine grape. So they have European wine grape characteristics, but they're Pierce's disease resistant. So this is something we should probably think about in the future. Dr. Alina Kaniva, who is a viticulturist in Alabama, has a vineyard of these planted, or some of these varietals, and they're doing quite well. And it's in Clanton, which is pretty far south and is in a high Pierce's disease risk zone. So in the future, we may have some more varieties to work with. The Pierce's disease risk suitability zone for the Southeast, I produced in my dissertation, but I was using this map is of area that is suitable for vinifera or European wine grapes, but also is Pierce's disease risky? So this map is really only showing you the area that could be good for those grapes I just mentioned. But in my current research, I've expanded that westward and I've extended it northward to where you're going to have extreme cold risk problems. And then I've limited it on the south where you're going to have Pierce's disease risk problems. So as far as a Pierce's disease risk suitability map, if you add up all of the other climate suitability, blue being good, red being bad, then this gives you a sense that there's quite a lot of zone climate-wise in Arkansas and to our west, Oklahoma, and to our east, that is generally suitable for vinifera. Now up there in Missouri, it's all about that cold winter temperature. And there's practices you can do like mounding up soil over the graft union. So if you get a really cold winter, at least it doesn't kill the scion, which is what kind of wood was grafted onto the rootstock. But it gives you a pattern that we do have a broad area of suitability. And so elevation is important. This is the absolute elevation of Arkansas. It makes it look like the Himalayas, and it's not. Our tallest mountain is right here in the valley. So our tallest mountain is in the valley, but it's really just kind of like a disjunct part of the Ouachita probably. So here we've got cold air drainage, this image that shows you that cold air is going to pond in the low area along the, and so cold air kind of follows the stream pattern. The watershed kind of drainage pattern tends to suggest where you're going to have cold air drainage on still nights where you have radiative cooling. So here behind this tree, you see that the cold air is ponding up. So you definitely want to take out all obstructions downhill to allow that cold air to drain downhill. And you want to seek that kind of thermal belt or that middle slope zone. And I would suggest higher middle slope to get away from that ponding cold air in the bottom of the valley. If you have Chardonnay, and you can maybe choose your site in such a way so that it's not going to be in the coldest part of the local surrounding area. I've zoomed into the Altus AVA and you can see the vineyards and how elevation is related to them. So they're on like a short plateau. This again looks really tall, but I just adjusted it relative to the extent. Down here on the Arkansas River is 300 something feet, and I think 900 feet up here on this little almost mesa. So I used this modeling technique, which I can talk about it at great length later because I know I'm running short. I used this modeling technique called Topographic Position Index. And there you're searching in an annulus, or like a donut, around every cell in the raster, the elevation raster. And you're asking the question, what is my elevation related to this zone around me? And so using the mean of the area falling in the donut and the standard deviation of that area, you essentially can create a z-score map. And you can know if you can basically assign to the z-scores classifications which tell you if it's a ridge or a valley or somewhere in the middle. And so that's what this slide means. The Topographic Position Index model showed this, essentially that we're close to the ridges and away from the valleys, which is what you would expect here in Altus. And it could suggest, this surface might suggest areas that will be good in the future. I'm zooming into Altus here, but we have this for the whole Southeast. It took a long time to do. And you can see it. This is the problem of the scale extent and the resolution of the data. I just thought this was a pretty good scale to show the natural patterns that exist. You can see there's a steep area along this kind of uplifted zone that Altus vineyards are on. And so their idea was that this is a mountain and like a hill in the valley, so all the cold air can drain away and you would still be kind of elevated off the valley floor. And they attribute that to people in Altus to it being a good suitable area. And I follow their point. This is about slope. This is about how steep the land is. And so those little orange areas are kind of the steep area along the outside of that little, plateau-like structure in around, actually north of the town of Altus. Okay. This is aspect, or the direction that the slope faces. and it's fairly meaningless. It's hard to interpret. This is the standard way that we draw it, but you can classify this and get a real good sense of how it could be useful to you. Hot slopes, cold slopes is how I have this set up right here. To the north, northeast, northwest, cold because of the direction that the sun is coming. To the south, southwest, especially hot. So if you have an early bud breaking varietal, you may want to put it on the north slope so it starts getting that warm sun on its trunk later in the year while the sun is at a low angle. Here I've zoomed into the Chateau Ozark vineyard blocks to show you kind of the scale of the model for slope. And you can see 1 to 5% slope is kind of typical. You can't go more than 30% slope because if you've ever driven a tractor and tried to turn it around on a hill, you know why. It's just not that. The vines don't care; they'll grow there, but you'll kill yourself on a really high slope piece of property. Here's the TPI showing that it's mostly along the ridge, these vineyards, and there's a low area in between that makes sense why we wouldn't put a vineyard there. And here's the direction it's facing. So this is mostly northern, right? And then there's a ridge, and then this is mostly southern. Now, the effective aspect actually has to be considered in relation to slope. In low slope, aspect is less meaningful. In high slope, aspect becomes meaningful in the ways that I'm talking about it. So you can't ascribe too much value to this if it's fairly low slope. But the higher slope you get, or the steeper the surface of the land, the more its aspect has an impact, has the aspect-related impact on the vineyard. I will say this, east is a good aspect, and here's why. In the south, we're humid, and that dew is on all the leaves in the morning. So the second the sun comes above the horizon, if you can get that sunlight onto the leaves, you're more likely to burn that dew off and have a lower fungal pressure because you have less humidity in the vineyard over time. So you can use aspect in some complicated ways. You can use it to choose for early bud break varietals. You can use it to choose for fungal load. As far as fungal load is concerned, we're on a 14-day fungicide spray routine here in Arkansas. That goes down to about 5 days if it rains. So it's really hard to have a quote unquote organic wine here because it's such a humid environment and there are so many rot problems in a humid environment. Here we're looking at the composite of all the topography and all the topographic suitability I talked about. So you do run out to see this broad area of high topographic suitability, that bluish color. And then low topographic suitability, the reddish color, you don't see vineyards located there, which makes sense. What do we have to do still? So I still have to assess the soil layers that I'm interested in, depth, drainage class, a set available water capacity as well. We have to grade those by basically classifying those values into suitability ranges and then assemble a composite suitability model for soil. And once I do that, I have a climate composite suitability model. I have a topographic composite suitability model. We do consider land cover in my suitability model because it's so much harder to work with land that was just cleared from a forest. So I'm gonna give you some bonus points if it's already cleared land, and then we'll basically take all those suitability models and weight them according to the literature, and which I do in my thesis and dissertation. Then I'll have the general suitability for viticulture here in Arkansas. Then we'll run after I do that, I can run suitability statistics for our AVAs and our vineyards to really kind of differentiate them from each other. And they can already use what I've done to help them differentiate them from each other in Arkansas and connect their physiographic setting with those around the world, right? You could say, well, my setting is somewhat like maybe Bordeaux or Galicia. Once I've quantified this for all the regions I talked about, both the AVAs and the vineyards. That is all I have. This is my daughter Eva as I am making Norton. That is Norton, not Cynthiana. And that's Cab Franc. Both of those are in front of my garage in North Carolina. but we don't grow a lot of grapes over here on Crowley's Ridge. So I hope to maybe make some relationships with some vineyards and continue that practice here. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, John. That was an absolutely wonderful presentation. We do have a couple of questions already populated into the Q&A. So we will review and read those.
Is that first one from Yakyan He? And hi, John. Are the images from Google Earth? I did have a few images from Google Earth. I'll show you which ones. It was the ones where I was showing you the vineyard. They're not actually necessarily from Google Earth. They could be the default Esri imagery, but I do use Google Earth sometimes when I make boundaries. Sometimes Google Earth has this imagery up there. It is NAPE. This is the 2019 NAPE, I think. And so it's not Google Earth owned imagery, it's federal imagery, but they sometimes display it when you zoom through the history. If that didn't answer it for you, you can put another question. I see you're welcome. All right. And then Mike Burgess, how are you able to differentiate Muscadine from bunch grape vineyards? I'm not. There are Muscadine vineyards in Altus, for instance, and I don't differentiate between them. I'm treating all vineyards the same, and I'm essentially, Muscadinea rotundifolia is the species name for Muscadine, or Vitis vinifera, or some hybrid. In the case of Norton or Cynthiana, it's Vitis estivalis. But those three species and hybrids in those species or between those species, interspecific hybrids, I'm not differentiating between them. They're all grown in the state. I definitely saw Seyval Blanc, which is a hybrid. I saw Chardonnay, and it's really doing bad over there. I think Chardonnay is going to be a hard place to grow Chardonnay. I tasted some Cab Sauv, Cabernet Sauvignon. There's definitely Chambourcin growing in the region, but the state grape, Cynthiana, that's Vitis estivalis. It's suitable here. I haven't gone to the level of applying variety to each of these. And you really have to apply it not to the vineyard block, because sometimes there'll be just a few rows of one variety and a few rows of another variety in the same block. So that's like a high labor, high level of detail, precision that I probably will never get to. Hopefully that answered your question, Mike.
All right. If we have any more other questions, feel free to populate those in the Q&A now. In fact, if you would like to actually join the conversation, feel free to use that raise your hand option, and we can actually bring you into the live conversation here if you've got something you'd like to talk to John about. All right. Looks like, Brian, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, is it okay if I ask a question and turn on the video?
Yeah, absolutely.
I was interested in, I love the talk, by the way. I was curious about your calculation of the topographic position index.
Let me go there.
It's a big one. And you said, you mentioned that you had run that for the entire Southeast. Is that this region that we're looking at here, this coverage, and I assume at 30-meter elevation?
Actually, I can show you. Let me think of which one. It's early on. See this? See how this is kind of chunky? This region here, and I don't know if you can tell. That's South Carolina but this is basically Virginia, southern West Virginia, North Carolina, most of South Carolina, then the northern portions of Georgia, Alabama, all of Tennessee, southern Kentucky, all of Missouri. And then it goes westward a little bit farther into Oklahoma and northeastern Texas, a little bit of northern Louisiana, but all of Arkansas. In this entire region, at the 10-meter scale, I have quantified TPI.
Very nice.
it'd be a good thing to test on the high performance computing.
Well, absolutely.
Set up. This took forever. Some of my processes, I would hit the button, Ryan, and it was like one of them ran for 14 days. And then a lot of the problem when working with Prism data is there's so many days. When you do some raster type out of that, it multiplies the number of files. So you have 58,000 days in whatever raster type you're using, a grid or like a raster data set inside of a geodatabase. You're multiplying that. I think in a raster data set inside of a geodatabase, there are 8 files associated with each raster. And so if I have a raster for the whole US, 58,000 times 8, I've put that many files into one folder. And Windows is not happy when you give it a folder of almost 300,000 files.
Right.
So it's just not a really optimal way to do it, but it worked. You're now at the computing point where even a consumer computer can do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. It's not easy to do. That's why I appreciated just how big a data you were dealing with. So thanks for sharing with us. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. So I think I have like 3 terabytes if I include everything and I pull it all out, but I throw a lot of stuff away along the way. But if I kept everything and every little iteration, it would be about that. That's actually pretty small data though. The Prism data is small.
Yeah.
Because it's 4 km resolution. The problem there is just all the files in one place. So big data is not just a problem with high resolution, it's a problem with file management, handling all those files.
So your tool of choice was primarily ArcMap, or was it ArcPro? What did you use primarily?
Well, I'd say 100%. I did my whole thesis and dissertation in ArcMap.
Okay.
But all of this is in ArcPro.
Gotcha.
And all of the stuff that I presented to you that I've done here was in ArcPro. But
yeah,
I had a slide or two from my I don't remember where it is. It was on my escape, but I'll make it faster. Pull it over here. The shot that I have from my dissertation is this one. So
yeah,
this
I was
noticing
noticing.
ArcMap, and
Yeah,
this was in ArcPro.
gotcha.
So I'm able to do this in both, but Pro is faster. The issue with Prism is not big files. So the multi-core threading benefit you get with Pro does not come in unless you have a large image like 3,000 pixels or more in size. These are not that big. So it's just file management. So Pro doesn't multi-thread for file management. So it's not benefit you. That I do like that technology. It does benefit you on the raster, like on the elevation side. So if I was talking about elevation, oh my goodness, it benefits you. I couldn't answer that TPI question, topographic position index. That's not right.
Yeah, the TPI is just so useful for so many folks. It's
yeah. So you can't actually make sense of this if you zoom out. Depends on, this is actually done. Yeah, I did this at 10 meter, and my annulus, this is a composite of 4 different annuli. So I did one really close based on structures that are really close. I looked at the region and found the gaps between the ridges and set one at that scale. I looked at these intermediate features in the drainage network and kind of set some of those middle top annuluses at those kind of middle scales. And then basically I came up with a TPI with everything and then took the average across all the TPI composites. So it's really kind of a multi-dimensional, kind of really sophisticated, broad view of topographic position index. This is not a simple, I don't really have time in this talk to go deep, but that gave you something to chew on.
Yeah. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, likewise, John. Thank you as well, Brian, for an absolutely excellent question. It does look like we have exhausted our questions for today, so I would like to express our sincere appreciation for all the panelists and the attendees and your questions today. I would like to ask everyone to mark their calendar for our presentation next month on June 16th. We'll have yet another Arkansas GIS User Forum educational webinar series installment. I would also like to take this moment to announce that the Arkansas GIS 2021 Symposium and Training registration is open and live. We would encourage everyone to visit gis-symposium.eventbrite.com to learn more. That concludes our presentation for today. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, John.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.